until about 4:30. So thank you for your patience as we pull everything together. Please help yourself to water and cheese. We just need like 5 more minutes to get a piece of paper back here from the glorious slideshow that awaits you.
Need some help.
Hello?
Yeah.
Sure.
Hello, help. Minerva.
Okay, so we want to take that down. Thank you, everyone, for coming. This is really a special occasion for me because I am a self-taught artist, and I began my training as a visual artist about 14 years ago when I started drawing at a life drawing studio called Spring Studio, which was in a location a few blocks from here, but it was run by Minerva Durham. And so I'm a big believer in these public spaces that are devoted to arts education for the people. So what I'm going to be sharing with you today is about 20 minutes of poetry. And this particular poetry project, as you'll see, is about the story of my becoming an artist by way of beginning as an artist model. So I called this presentation "A Woman on Paper." There was a quote by Alfred Stieglitz when he first saw the drawings of Georgia O'Keeffe. He supposedly said, "Finally, a woman on paper." So that always struck a chord with me. That said, I am going to be reading my poems off of my phone, so please forgive me for that. But there's plenty of paper and art for you to look at after the reading. So I'm going to start actually with a poem that I wrote around the time that I met Minerva. This poem was recently made the daily poem by the Paris Review. I had published it with them in 2012, but the poem has a longer history than that because I wrote it in around 2005. And so it's called Insomnia. I have been courting sleep and catering to its taste in nightgowns. I have poured it heady vintage wines and frivolous bubbly new ones. I have wet my lips with chamomile and tried up different poses. I have kept to my side of the bed at first, then flung my limbs all over. Oh, stubborn lover, nightly I lie, chasing stillness to seduce you. Though we both know it, what drives me wild is your race mad refusal. I'm happy to say I'm sleeping much better now. Thanks in part to some nice friends who have put me up for a couple nights. So the next poem I'd like to read is from the same era, around 2005. And in this instance, I'm just going to, because this poem is about this work of art by Georgia O'Keeffe, I'm going to let you look at the work while I read the poem I wrote. O'Keeffe's Music, Pink and Blue. Maybe it was the title, but it's too late for me to know for certain why at 8 I hung a copy on my bedroom wall. It seems to me I'm starting to recall I'd gone to the library by myself to find collected paintings on the shelf. I think I'd seen her calendar of flowers, irises and lilies. And for hours I sat admiring petals and their hues, their plume-like curves and boldness. I refused to close the book till I had memorized each flower, as if that would give me eyes to paint like her, the master of her craft. I wonder if my parents ever laughed or wrung their hands to see their child gaze so deeply and intensely at the ways nature could suggest or shout out sex. Perhaps they failed to see it. I sat and sketched orange tiger lilies and blue morning glories, copying the endless inventory. But then I saw an old book, fabric bound, and grasped for it. Something flitted down, a Xerox of music, pink and blue, not flowers, but rather something leading us to I didn't know the word for it, our song, an entrance painting with its sounds, belong. So, I chose this poem to read on this occasion in part because it's about visual art, and this is a talk about artwork and poetry and the intersections, and also because O'Keeffe herself was translating at the time and experiencing a kind of synesthesia. She was listening to a song in a friend's music lecture when she started the initial sketches for this work. And throughout my various creative practices, I am often translating through the senses. I also do a lot with wine and perfume. And incidentally, I lost hearing in 1 year, the same year that I was living in France, and I started learning about wine. So this kind of fluidity between smell and hearing and sight and touch and sound is very important to me as a way of orienting myself in the world. So in 2005 was when I mentioned I first met Minerva, and I started working as an artist model. And so that now is increasingly becoming important to me to reflect on as I've become a visual artist myself, and I'm thinking back on how these experiences were very formative in my career. So the manuscript that I put together is called Nude Untangling Her Hair, and it's a collection of prose poems and lyric poems and hair drawings. And so I'm going to read to you some excerpts from that, starting with a few prose poems. Posing. I needed the pocket money. That's what I typically say when people ask me how I became an artist model years ago, before I became an artist. From 2001 to 2008, I had a day job as a temp on Wall Street. I blew all of my paychecks on rent in a neighborhood I couldn't afford. Jobs came easily. I typed fast and had a big Midwestern grin that people mistook for guilelessness. I also had an unbridled manner, which, according to John Berger's ways of seeing, fit a certain bill for my gender. In the language of oil painting and advertisements, he says, women are one of several archetypes. Serene mother, Madonna. Perfect hostess, spectator, owner's wife. Sex object, Venus, nip surprise. And freewheeling secretary, actress, king's mistress. I hated multitasking and made a lousy assistant, but I got to be young and lost in New York. Every morning as I crossed Park Avenue at 53rd Street, I looked up over my right shoulder to burn the image of the MetLife building into my eyelid album. I can still close my eyes and see her now, tall and nurse white against a glittering boulevard. One has to bolt, taxis, tulips, taxis, as soon as the walk sign turns in order to make the light. Each time I crossed, I'd hear an inner hum of the title sequence to the Mary Tyler Moore Show. You're gonna make it after all. And then I'd toss an invisible beret in the air, which still hangs there like a waxing moon, forever shedding new light on that chapter of my youth. Wow. Soho. In 2005, I lived in a brownstone on McDougal Street. Not the loud part, I always told people while making parentheses with my hands, but the block that's south of Houston. My meaningless day job was wearing on me, and I was itching for adventure. I made up my mind to leave my job and travel. I would go to France to teach English to school children. When I was 11, I found a 4-leaf clover pressed between the pages of a French grammar book in a used bookstore. I twirled it in my hand so often that it finally broke, but the page retains the darkened stain of the clover's 4 leaves. I had to go, I knew, but first I had one summer left in New York. Suddenly, my neighborhood became the movie set to my vanishing youth. Before work, I used to get my lattes at the bakery around the corner from my apartment. Often, I would stand and sip them from across the street. I loved the building's pistachio green facade, its old-world cannoli counter, and line of stylish patrons going in and out. I wanted to be in the Vesuvio bakery and behold it at the same time, to be both a protagonist in and witness to this chapter of my life. My surroundings became like a lover's flesh, my eyes and hands unquenchable as time hurtled me toward the inevitable parting. Cobalt Blue. From an early age, I fancied I was an atavism of my paternal grandfather, Frederick L. Barbour I, who was an oil painter. He died before I was born. Then a neighborhood girl whose father was an astronomy professor told me that all artists are poor. We were in the sandbox building a rocket ship out of a cardboard box. It was widely recognized throughout our neighborhood that this young girl was a genius. My grandfather was also a physician. I went to college to study medicine, but came out a poet. When I asked my mother about my grandfather, she gave me a crystal ball she'd bought at a garage sale. She said that when the light shone through, it was the same hue he had used in his moonlit seascapes. The paintings all burned in a house fire when I was 3. Cobalt blue salts are obtained by sintering cobalt oxide and aluminum oxide together at 1200 degrees Celsius. John Varley, William Blake's friend, who was an oil painter as well as an astrologer, suggested that it was the ideal color for skyscapes. I lost my father before I could ask him what he remembered about my grandfather. Sometimes I like to place the crystal ball on my poetry manuscripts or a pad of drawing paper. I let people think that it's a paperweight, but I put it there so that my lost loved ones can guide me in capturing and refracting light. There is much about that side of my family I'll never know. What I do know is that cobalt blue is extraordinarily stable. A delay on paper. Most children quit drawing around the age of 7. Scientists have postulated this is due to the lateralization of the brain. The left analytical hemisphere develops rapidly and begins to dissect and critique the images produced by the right visual hemisphere. Names and symbols supplant perception of light and edges. Girls, it has often been observed, demonstrate keener body consciousness than boys. They realize the disparity between their bodies and its representations, and so are apt to quit drawing sooner. Perhaps owing to patience, for which I was once awarded the Bus Stop Award at Girl Scout camp, the value of which seemed to me discredited by the persistent reminders that patience is a virtue, or more likely, to a degree of impudence. I once famously kicked a curio cabinet after overhearing my grandmother tell my mother I was too young to be sitting next to breakables. I disobeyed the tyrannical left brain and protracted the painful penitence of drawing badly while simultaneously learning to read and write. Letters became half-formed animals yearning to hop off the page. My eyes leapt round before I got to the end of any one line. My mother, who wrote her dissertation on literacy in children, began quizzing me with a set of phonics flashcards. After getting them repeatedly wrong, I threw the cards across the room and reached for my crayons and drawing paper. I like to imagine a parallel universe in which I remain forever 7 years old. There I sit making drawing after drawing, a storm cloud of phonics hanging precipitously above my head. Like this, I keep the reign of reason suspended, while every letter I draw retains its right to come alive. Eventually, I relented to the lexical world and all but quit drawing with 2 curious exceptions. In private, I had a penchant for doodling wildflowers and solitary eyes. A closet artist. Once I decided to become a writer and not a physician, I sat down in my childhood home in Champaign, where I had set up a desk in my closet to try my hand at short story writing. I came up with a penniless character named Agnes, who worked in an artist studio in France, where she took her clothes off for a painter named Henri. She didn't know whether she was genuinely in love with him or simply felt a rush in being transformed by his draftsmanship. Dimples, sags, concavities, and asymmetries got erased or hallowed as divine insignias. She longed to slip into one of his canvases for good, perhaps the one with the forest background, so she could go walking at night, and then return by day to sit in timeless beauty for all the passers-by at the Louvre. At home, she drew ink nudes on her forearm and later watched them fade away in the bath. Portrait after portrait, she gradually realized she was all of these women, and yet none of them. In the end, Agnes left Henri for a bald man. It was unclear whether she really fancied him or simply enjoyed drawing his head. Moonlighting. The first two art schools I called told me classes were not in session over the summer. When I called a life drawing studio in Soho, a woman picked up. "Have you done this before?" she said. "No," I said. "Will you draw?" she said. "Yes," I lied. "I mean, not in a while, but sure I do." "Well," she said, "come into the studio at 6 tonight, and I'll give you some charcoal and some drawing paper. You can see what the model does, and if you think you can do it after that, we can speak. Models get paid $15 an hour." This is a while ago. "They also get to draw for free. Ask for me, Minerva," she said. "Thanks," I said. I was already cringing inside with imposter complex. I thought of the story of Cadman, which begins every anthology of English verse. As Bede, the father of English history, recounts, this illiterate cowherd attended boozy banquets that often ended in song. When the harp came out and the guests began to sing in turn, Cadman, who knew no songs, would excuse himself and sneak home. One night he fell fast asleep and had a dream. An intruder arrived and stood above him where he lay. "Cadman, sing me something," he commanded. The cowherd protested and asked what he could possibly sing about, since he knew no songs. The intruder responded, "Sing to me of the first creation." Cadman proceeded to sing, in his dream, what is now known as the first recorded poem in the English language. I made up my mind to go to the studio and avail myself to a power outside of me. "I think you should forget this modeling BS and be an artist," Minerva whispered, "because you can really see." I jumped in my chair. I hadn't realized she was standing behind me. "Thanks," I said, but I still need the money. And so that was how I began my training as an artist on both sides of the easel.
Oh, that's cool.
So the next section of poems in the manuscript is called Quick Poses. And with the first poems, I like to show them to the readers and the audience because the line breaks and the visual aspects of the poem are, I find, very important. So this poem is called Cadman, Draw Me Something. And then body spoke. I breathed in preverbal proverbs, only slower. Nudity and light were irreducible, were impulses down my arm onto carbon in space. Whatever I thought was, spirit was, thoughtless thought in optical and proper, Bowler digital nerves. 1 minute, one pose, 20 poses, 60 seconds each. Minerva calls, begin. The back ripples, as if uncertain, as if it doesn't approve of its audience, yet it settles, keenly remembers itself as spine, head to buttocks. An S-curve begs contact. This is not the touching that vanishes when lovers part. No, this back, it is asking to be memorized. It begs to be a relic of touch, the element between my moving hand and paper. I watch my mind unwind itself darkly and in stills, as a bone-conjured wisdom hot wires wrinkles in my alphabet. I discover the action of a curling arm rather than curling it, into its pose. I chase the image of and images becoming over time. Minerva calls out, stop. No ideas, but in 30 frames per second, the psychogeography of a chill. A thought wanders into pattern, then oblivion, then the sound of light rings in my ear. Oh, rhythmic hiss of weight on the stage, your ribcage is my soul, and this Strathmore 500 sheet between us just captured my breath. Posing, I stand still, unravished on the stage, under hot lights. The fan whirs. Your hands sweep shadow excess and error effacement into oscillating air, coating me in a skein of cremated willow. At home, in the shower, your drawings shed my body, linger round my ankles for a moment. Cinder shackles unthink and unbrink themselves, resounding in concentric echoes of carbon rings. Tinnitus. Into the empty air, our dendrites go toward the indefinite longing for relation. You, other, always deserved much better than death on an altar, or the eternal echo of a light you did not see. I assure you, I will never forget that gap, you, my image of you. It is manifesting today as a threadbare drone of dizzy bees. What we needed. The model lunges. I sit and knead my eraser. Its fibers stretch and snap, then fuse together again. Now lump of clay, now threads of airy silk. Like this, I wait for the luminous particular to arise on the stage, a knotted knee, a cavernous clavicle. 1 hour or more passes, and I begin to see this model stranger as an unknown self, brother, sister, and also a person yet unfathomed. Later, in the streets and subways, I fall into the automatic art of searching for my starting point. And for an afternoon or so, all umbrages dissolve, and everyone is beautiful. The next section is called Standing Female Nude, and it's in prose poems. So I'm going to give you an image instead. A balancing act. In the studio, eyes have fingertips and the flesh has eyes. On stage, I learned to imagine my pose from every angle and easel in the room. This triumph over space and time threw me into a trance-like state of meditation. Occasionally, during longer poses, I would have the uncanny sense that all my body parts had suddenly stopped communicating with one another. I was convinced that in the next second, my body might slacken and collapse. It was as if I had exhausted each muscle's conception of the whole pose, the way a word repeated many times eventually becomes meaningless and strange. It seemed I had been relying on the artist in the room to hold up my elbow, splay up my pinky, and cock out my hip with their crayons and gazes. If an artist looked away too long, I feared I might lose my balance. During these periods, I would stare at the rings in the wood paneling of the floorboards. There I could call on the infallible memory of trees to ground me. My muse appears. Within the vessel elements and ray fleck of the wooden floorboards, I saw faces and body parts that held my gaze and so helped me to steady my pose. A strange phenomenon soon overtook me. I began to see female figures everywhere, in dimples in the plaster, or cascading paisleys in the drapery. They followed me home at night. One evening in the shower, I squeezed the water from my hair and fallen strands came off in my hands. I smeared them across the wall and saw a woman's head, a chignon at the base of her neck. With a few strokes of my finger, the rest of her body soon appeared, her elongated back and legs curving and twisting her into some place where I longed to follow. And so I began my private drawing practice. So that concludes the poetry portion of the evening. I'm going to show you a few slides of some more of my hair drawings, and then I've selected 3 delicious wines for us to try together, and I invite you all to look at the transferred, look at the,
have people come through?
Yeah.
Bring in some chairs.
I'm going to show some, but
Yeah,
yeah, come in and sit.
Get in, yeah. Chairs is over there.
Bring up chairs right there.
Come in. Get in here. What are your names?
So yeah, everybody come in, get comfortable. I'm going to show you a few more slides of my hair drawings.
Barbour, if you can let people, there's chairs right behind you.
Yes, there's chairs over here. Let me get on. Okay, let me go. Go ahead, go ahead. Got it? Got it? Go ahead.
So once I began this practice of drawing with my hair on the shower wall, I very soon got addicted to it. I would take pictures of it, and I shared it with a few people, and most people, if you've had long hair, if you've shared a dwelling space with someone who does, you've probably seen a mass of snarled hair on the shower wall, and it can be, you know, it's fascinating the way that hair is a sign of youth and sensuality when it's attached to us, and the moment that there's a loose one, it shuts down the city. You know, you find it in your hamburger. But even you know, someone's brush or on the shower wall, there's this aversion people have to it, and I find that powerful and fascinating, because I think what's really going on is that in some small way it makes us think of our mortality, you know, because this hair is now part of us and yet detached, and it was once a sign of life and now it's a sign of death. And so spinning this image into, or spinning this hair into the image of a sensual nude, I find to be just a powerful kind of love song to life, and the fact that it actually, by remembering that our material forms are temporary, we live more passionate lives. So eventually I found a way to immortalize the hair drying by using this adhesive transparent film called Frisket, which watercolorists use to protect portions of their painting that they don't want to change. And so I then transferred these hair drawings to paper, which you can walk around and see afterwards. So I'll just show you a few more. Unfortunately, they're a little bit, maybe I can adjust the brightness or something. They're a little bit bright here, but well, this one anyway has been transferred to paper and is now with a private collector in Stockholm. I exhibited this in a group show in Joshua Tree. One thing, unfortunately you can't see the lines. Well, one thing that I really appreciate about this drawing practice is the way that it makes me reflect on drawing as a practice throughout the ages. So I gave a talk at the College Art Association annual conference last year on a drawing panel where I situated this practice in the longer context of line drawing throughout art history. So one thing that I invite you to consider as you're looking at the hair on paper drawings later is just like what we react to when we look at a drawing, because for me this practice is in dialogue with drawing, as I said, throughout the ages, and I think that right now there's a resurgence of interest in drawing because for people who saw the Michelangelo show at the Met a couple of years ago, there's something about drawing that seems to connect us to the mind of the creator. And so drawing in the public imagination has this element of trace about it. And so that's one thing that my practice is playing with, because trace is, I tell people I don't sign my drawings because I have the ultimate signature. It's my mitochondrial DNA. But it's all, in a playful way, commenting on this public fascination with the idea of drawing being somehow closer to the artist, intention, and spirit. You really can't see those lines, can you? Well.
You darken the image?
Maybe if we turn off the light.
You turn the rheostat behind you in the center, pull down the line. Bruce, you wanna go over and get the rheostat? Pull the rheostat where the light goes,
There you go.
no, you turn it off, just turn the rheostat down. Just turn the rheostat.
You can fade it out.
Can you see it yet?
No. It's right.
It was overexposed, that's
Yeah.
the problem with it.
The flash. was-
Yeah, I can see it okay on my screen, but
I mean, there might be a brightness setting on the projector, but I'm
Yeah.
not sure.
Yeah.
It's not
it's
gonna
okay.
I don't know.
well, we will drink wine and look at the drawings on paper, which are even better. On the projector, I don't know, but I can just turn it off.
Just unplug it.
Is the fan on? Running?
You think be using it anymore? Should I
No,
get out of the way?
you can take it.
Yeah.
Susan, have you actually begun pulling your own hair out of your head, or do you just always have a constant, it hasn't come to that point?
So it's a good question, and I've read that actually it's normal to lose up to 100 hairs per day. So I don't brush my hair that often, so it tends to only come out when I'm washing it in the shower. Since my hair is so long now, I actually find that, I would have to be drawing constantly, 24/7 to use what I already have naturally.
Yeah, it's all.
So, how do you, is the hair from your mind? Are you drawing? I mean, you get the hair and you get a model and you...
Is the figure from something preconceived?
Yeah.
So one of the most important things about the practice for me is that I don't begin with a preconceived pose. What happens is whatever hair comes out naturally when I wash my hair, I put on the wall, and then it's really just play. It's just moving around like finger painting until something emerges, and I think I see an elbow or a waist or a leg, and then I become very fascinated with what this woman is telling me. And so I'm just moving it around, and to me it's a process of kind of falling in love with the gesture that's before me, and so it presents itself in this very organic way. Also because obviously hair can only do so many kinds of curves or angles, or so there's a built-in restriction, and that to me is a very generative process in this act, because I often relate it to a French poetry movement called Oulipo, and this was in the early, like 1960s, that these French poets decided, I really miss the sonnet because it pushed people to discover new words and to actually change their train of thought, because they were required to rhyme or to have a certain meter. And so they would come up with arbitrary rules because the Alexandrian sonnet felt a bit stale. So they would say, okay, let's write a poem that only uses the vowel E, or a book that doesn't use the letter E. and their dictum, which I often take as my own in my visual practice, is if everything is permitted, then nothing is possible. And so one of the restrictions I work with is I never cut my hair. So oftentimes there's a drawing right here, for example, above Mary Barbour's head, that I had drawn just the outline of the back, and then I said, oh crap, now I have 6 inches of hair left, and I have to find something to do with it. And then it turned out, I said, oh well, what if it could sort of describe the shoulder blades? And then it fell into this beautiful sort of loop that made me very happy, because it also echoed the loops of the buttocks and created this wonderful harmony. But that's a formal step that I wouldn't have thought to imagine had I not been forced to.
Do you only use your own hair, or have you use other people's for
I have,
color?
yeah,
shading?
I have to date only used my hair, mostly because I feel like it's a limiting project to begin with, because I have friends who I have Sicilian friends, I have black friends whose hair doesn't stick to the wall, and there are artists who, Syrian artist Mona Hatoum, for example, works with her hair, but she makes balls, she makes sculptures, so there are other things that hair can do. My hair happens to draw figures in a cursive sort of ligature kind of way. So I'm hesitant to sort of appropriate other people's hair and claim that I would know what to do with it.
Yeah, big hundred men's hair.
So how do you get, so your drawings on your bathroom wall, on the tiles, how do you get it onto the paper with the frisket
Yes.
over it?
So I think I have a piece here I can show everybody. It's quite a simple process, actually. So I have this, this is frisket film, and it is transparent and adhesive, and it has a paper backing. So I just remove the paper backing here, peel it off, and then it's pretty simple. I just have to smooth it over, and then it comes right off. I let it dry for a second, and then I press it to cotton rag paper.
So you,
Voila.
So you kind of draw it on the wall and then you just transfer it to.
or you let it dry first?
Yeah, I actually have to do it while it's wet,
Oh,
because if I don't do it while it's wet, it's really just the temporary adhesive bonds of H2O that keep it in place. If it dries, then she just withers and falls off the wall.
Hey Sue, how long are your showers?
That's a good question. So I would say each drawing takes probably an average of 2 hours, but I turn the water off, especially, just to be a conservationist of water. But as long as the hair is wet and there's a bit of moisture on the ceramic, then I'm good to go. Should we taste some wine?
Yes.
yeah.
So I have 3 wines I'm super excited about. One is organic.
Which one?
That one. Yes, so the Fresa. Let's actually, let's start with this Gaulois, though. So this one is natural. One's organic, one's natural, and one's biodynamic. And I thought this would be...
organic.
This one's organic, yeah.
This is natural.
This one's biodynamic. I'll explain the difference. Yeah.
What does it mean?
And, okay, so I will explain the difference. It's a source of confusion for many people. So we'll start with that one if you want to pour some, because that's the lightest in body, if you want to form a line and
everyone get some food over there.
yeah, and there's cheese, and help yourself to water. And so So we're starting with a natural wine. This is the Gamay grape, which comes from Beaujolais. This wine is made from Beaujolais, just to the south of Burgundy in France. So you have organic and biodynamic, which both pertain to what happens in the vineyard, and it's a farming stipulation. Basically, there are lots of regulations about what you can and can't do to the soil and to the vines. Then natural refers to what happens during the vinification process. So this is all in the cellar. So a natural wine, the number one distinction between the taste of a natural wine and non-natural wines is that they use indigenous yeast. So what that means is that they aren't, a lot of people aren't aware of the fact that winemakers can use, they can sort of mail order yeast that will produce a watermelon Jolly Rancher flavor or a banana flavor or there are trade fairs where you can go and you can sell all these different yeasts. So with a natural wine, it's really just like, I mean, it's like the difference between Minerva Durham or baker's yeast and sourdough. So it's just the yeast that's found in the air and on the skin of the grape. What that does is it produces much earthier, kind of barnyardy aromas. So some people are totally crazy about them. It's quite a fad right now. There are a lot of natural wine bars. I've seen a lot in New York and LA, throughout Europe, certainly. There are tons right now. So somebody pass me a glass of wine.
Oh, sorry. No, that's the sorry.
There's two on them. I got them at Astor. Astor things. Yeah. I like this. Yeah.
What was the inspiration?
So this
Hi. I gotta get you big
Oh.
Oh, you stopped, right? You might want to stop it. Well, because everyone's walking milling about, that wouldn't do you much good. I would suggest you take that off and do close-up shots of the wine.
It's great. Yeah, they're so nice.
You know, like bring it closer. Pictures of the label or something.
You do 1 45-minute presentation and you require all students and all their faculty to go. So it's very, yeah.